Hello and welcome to Walk the Talk Show with Waylon Lewis, coming to you live from Boulder, Colorado. I'm in Hotelephant, which I now am, since reading Dr. Mark Nelson's book here. It's a beautiful book. I'm trying to center it there. The Wastewater Gardener. I suddenly am looking at my sewage lines with suspicion. So, Dr. Mark Nelson, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, we know him affectionately as Horseshit, if you've read the book. Yeah, so we begin these videos before we get into the topic of poop, shit, caca, whatever you want to call it. We're going to call it holy shit for most of the video because it's actually got a lot of wonderful stuff about it, and society is kind of like out of sight, out of mind, pushed it away, which is silly. We're learning, and so we begin these with a bow. If everyone who's watching this wants to take a good posture, you can kind of ground your butt appropriately in the earth. You can kind of just take a good but relaxed posture, have your head connect with the heavens, and then your heart is the principal, sort of like a Japanese bow. The heart connects heaven and earth in friendship, and you offer that friendship to Mark and to everyone else who shares a mission of being of benefit. So thank you. And then Mark has agreed to lead us in a little contemplation or meditation or prayer.
Yes, so let's start with remembering that every action that we take is important and that we can make a difference. And I think a nice offering for the prayer would be to have reverence for yourself, for the others, and for the biosphere that sustains us all.
So, Mark, maybe you could just very briefly tell us your sort of overall story, like your biography, you know, how you got into this whole path, and the biosphere too, which is, I remember in high school, I was in high school when that happened. It was like front page news everywhere. It was a big deal, pretty fascinating. And then what you've been doing for the last while.
Okay, we'll give it a shot for maybe 30 seconds. So, New York City kid, born in Brooklyn, grew up in Queens, first generation son of immigrant Jewish family from Russia and Poland. Went to an Ivy League school, decided that I didn't want to stay in academia. I wanted to do something of significance to improve my life and the life of people around me. Through a series of serendipities, found a group of people who had gone back to the land, I think maybe was the phrase of the late 60s, on 160 acres of crappy land in New Mexico. And we founded an institute to try to bring the worlds of ecology and technology together. Went to Australia because we have a series of projects around the world trying to do hands-on work in really difficult, challenging biomes. One of my colleagues at the Institute, John Allen, came up with the idea of Biosphere 2. We're very excited. We think that going into space, will teach us a lot about planet Earth, and it's part of our destiny as exploring human beings. And really, really luckily, I was locked up in there for 2 years. Was in charge of the sewage system, which is part of the reason why this book ensued. Went back, got a PhD in ecological engineering, and I've been dealing with shit and working on ecoteching projects around the world.
Well, thank you, Mark. That was awesome. What's that? So there's so much here, but maybe first we could talk about that crappy land you went to. Because I just read that part, and it's fascinating. You talked about sort of the history of the land, that it had a lot of growth, but then people tried to farm it.
Yeah, it's kind of indicative of the mentality of, let's call it, rapacious humans who are not, the opposite of sustainability. There are resources out there, let's exploit them. So the Southwest was opened up, in fact, most of America, with the crazy idea that rain follows the plow. So when people hit the Southwest, what might have worked, better, not great in the Midwest and the South, was a disaster. So this piece of land, amazingly enough, they dynamited the pinyons and juniper trees. This is in the 1920s, planted a few crops of wheat and corn,
Yeah.
and it does occasionally have good rain years here. They got a crop or two, set off a cycle of soil erosion, which kind of mirrors what's happened to a great deal of New Mexico and the Southwest.
So Mark, this is so fascinating. You're saying so much that so it was this, obviously this natural ecosystem that was healthy, and then we Americans went in and kind of understandably, as you said, the rain follows the plow. We thought we could till the earth and it would become this rich farmland.
Right.
But,
I do
yeah,
have to say the blame is shared with our Hispanic people who came a few centuries before we did. For example, in the area I am, which is, there's some irrigation that supports farms, but very little. They were running 100,000 sheep, you know, in the area that we're in.
right.
So back even in the 19th century, people would talk about New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, grass being up, halfway up the side of a horse. And almost every acre in New Mexico that a grazing animal could reach is pretty devastated.
Wow. So we turned this tundra with grass as high as a horse into just bare sand that was getting blown away every year.
Yeah, I mean, there are some bits of the Southwest that are desert, but it's really been desertified by inappropriate human action.
And
This,
you were
this,
saying
this,
we went in and literally dynamited the trees out of the way.
yeah, I mean, when we were first here, and basically we said, well, we're starting from the situation. Can we make a habitable oasis? And one of the core things that's always intrigued me about the group that I'm working with, and now, of course, there's many, many people on the same track. There's one thing to exclude people, make a national park, make a protected area, and that's all great. And, we need to do that for the really special places. But the lingering question is, how do we make where people live so that the human actions actually enhance the ecology and we're not a factor running it downhill?
Right.
So that's why I became the horseshit king of New Mexico for a couple of years,
Right.
because quite simply, the biggest trees at Synergia Ranch, where I'm speaking to you from now, were dead trees when we arrived. We planted about 1,000, shade, windbreak, and fruit trees. We made hundreds of tons of compost to
Right.
replace the missing soil.
Mark, that's where you first learned about the power of compost. You were saying you put so much compost around these trees, right?
Yeah, exactly. The power of coup. I mean, Synergia Ranch and restoration was built on using what's normally thrown away or considered a toxic waste. And
So
in those days, we also had all outhouses here, which is fine. I mean, the
right.
groundwater is 200 feet below. We're not going to pollute it.
You were
And
saying actually that outhouses are kind of wonderful. They're obviously cold. They're kind of annoying in some ways, but they create all this compost or this, rich poop kind of stuff, and then you can literally just plant a tree in the outhouse and move it.
yeah, exactly. We did that, but and we also moved the outhouse away. And one of my first jobs was shoveling out those contents into a wheelbarrow.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of conservative in a way. I think that when you do make compost, and the term now is human manure, that you compost that really well, get the temperatures up, leave it for a long time because pathogens die. But then don't take it to the vegetable garden. Put it under a tree, a fruit tree, ideally, because then there's a huge separation between the food that you harvest and that material.
Yeah, I think it's happening more. It's beginning to happen. There was this big article in the New York Times you may have read about how, all the bacteria that we've been trying to kill, like antibacterial soaps and what do you call it? Deodorant. I don't use it, so I can't even think of the word. And we've been trying to kill it, and it's actually healthy to have healthy bacteria on your body. And we have the same attitude towards poop, that it's just evil and disease-ridden and stinky and funny. But
Yeah,
it's
totally.
actually incredible. If treated knowledgeably, like how you do it, it can be safe, and not only safe, it can create life.
Yeah, I mean, the really nice story about our poop and about our even our bodies. We are as much a microbial ecosystem as we are an individual, great, august Western, organism.
Yeah.
We have, I think it's 100 times more microbial cells in our body working with our body as we have human cells, but they're really small.
Wow. Wow. So, and then how specifically, I loved how you specifically got your nickname Horseshit because you took it a step farther. You wanted to create this huge orchard in the desert, right?
Yeah,
So how did,
yeah.
yeah,
We won't get that fact and figure, but I love always sharing this because if people don't know it, horses are fairly big animals. I think they're not super efficient when they're eating grass or hay. And on average, a horse produces 17,000 pounds of manure a year. That's 50 pounds a day, which
50
means
pounds
if,
of poop a day. Think
yeah,
about those people.
think about it. I know. So, in those days, we had a lot of, domestic animals. We had horses and llamas and sheep and pigs and chickens and all that.
Yeah.
Well, very happily, Santa Fe Downs, a racetrack which only flourished for maybe 5 years, was about 7 miles from the ranch. I would rent a dump truck, and they had 1,200 horses. So do the math. They were they were creating mountains of horse shit there, and so if somebody
They had
showed
no
up,
idea what to do with it, right?
no, they didn't know what to do with it, and they were really happy to save the gas on their own dump trucks to fill mine up.
Right.
So, I didn't keep track, but at least 500 tons of horse manure was brought to the ranch to one, start the 400 tree fruit orchard, and to really bolster up all of the trees that we planted around the place.
You're making me want to go like get a pickup truck and get a bunch of poop.
Well, if anybody out there, needs a source of, manure for their compost heap, just find out anyone who has horses loves to see someone turn up with a pickup truck and either a snow shovel or a pitchfork
Right.
because they get buried in it very, very quickly.
Right. Yeah, that's a really interesting thing I never understood, and I consider myself an environmentalist until I read this morning. That you said traditionally farmers were, what do you call it? They weren't specialists.
Yeah, they were. I mean, old MacDonald had a farm, and he wasn't a specialist only growing corn or potatoes or wheat. He had his animals, and what did he do with the manure from his animals? He broadcasted onto his land.
Right. He had a need for the poop that his animals were creating. He put it on the crops.
Right.
And now it's actually a huge toxic waste problem. There's all this poop in these factory farm situations, polluting the waters.
Yeah, we go through it in the book, but I kind of like, there's a great saying about ecology is it makes you realize that everything is connected to everything.
Right.
So, when you either think about water, that'll get you to everything that humans do, and even more so if you think about shit, poop, both the animal type and the human type. It's the choices we've made, which may have made some sense a couple of centuries ago, but it's a paradigm that really is outmoded.
So to finish that farm conversation, which just blew my mind, because it's so common sense, they would take the poop and put it on the
Yeah,
crops, and and the crops would create great land. But now we spend tons of money, right,
yeah,
doing what to the crops because we don't have the poop.
yeah. So now we, because it's more convenient, comes in a sack. We buy chemical fertilizers, which are expensive for the farmer, driving small farmers to the brink of bankruptcy all the time. They release greenhouse gases. They have to be trucked all over the world.
Yeah.
And here's the kicker: 50% of the fertilizer that gets applied to the land doesn't even help the crops. It basically runs off into the groundwater or pollutes rivers, oceans, lakes, etc.
So
So
we're charging farmers tons of money for what they used to get for free to create chemical fertilizer that often is toxic and runs off and pollutes the water. And then on the other side, the poop isn't being used, so there's a big waste problem there, polluting
Yeah,
water.
exactly. I mean, one of the things that there's a fantastic book.
That's
It's
my
now
one.
out of print, but I think you can get copies of it. It was reissued by Rodale Press. It's called Farmers of 40 Centuries.
Uh-huh.
And right around the time that we were making these decisions to, bring tractors on instead of using horses and oxen and whatnot, and turn to chemical fertilizers, a wonderful, very quantitative, detailed scientist from the States went over, studied China, Japan, and Korea. And, so he titled his book, The Reality He Saw. They, they had incredibly intensive production, high populations, but they've been doing it for 4,000 years at least. And so in the book, I reproduced one of these pictures. Just shows you how much modern way of thinking has gone down from what we used to do. This is the city of Shanghai, you know, big city back in 1900 as well. They collect the night soil, which is, I think, my favorite euphemism for the topic we're talking about.
Right.
The night soil gets collected from all the houses in Shanghai, gets brought down, sold to boatmen, who
Who are
then go,
waiting in the
yeah,
river for it to pay,
yeah,
and they pay for it.
they pay for it because then they go upriver and they sell it to the farmers, who, after all, are feeding the city of Shanghai.
Right.
And the farmers compost it and then put it back on the land. So first off, for the city of Shanghai, sewage is not an expense, and all its residents don't have a big sewage tax and utility bill.
Right.
And the fertility that came from the land that's producing the food, it's being returned. So the cycle is being completed.
You
By the
told the
way,
story in your book, Wastewater Gardener. Again, I'm going to show it again because I'm so into it. That about how, like, was it in World War II the troops were blown away in Korea or something? You know what I'm
I,
talking about?
well, there's a couple of things. One, in World War One, the
One.
term crapper came from American troops who were stationed in the UK and England. And there's a kind of famous man in the world of indoor plumbing called whose name happened to be Thomas Crapper. And
Wow.
he invented, essentially, because they had indoor plumbing, which vastly increased water use, but they didn't have a good way of washing away our turds. He invented the flush toilet that put a regulated amount, to flush the water away. So the troop said, I'm going to the crapper, because his name was on all those fixtures.
So funny.
But the other thing, by the way, in traditional Asia, even now, they never use the word shit as a term of approbation, as a bad term.
Right.
And the other anecdote I love is, if a farmer happened to have land next to a road, he would really build a beautiful outhouse to try to entice travelers to come and use his facility.
That's what I was
Because,
thinking of. They were like, please come poop in our outhouse.
exactly. So
Tourists.
at Biosphere 2, when I started really getting interested in the human version of shit, we had the same thing. We had built a small test module, and we had a constructed wetland. And when we didn't have human closure experiments, we would invite the staff to go into the test module and take a dump. And you could see the plants would get really happy when someone did that, because suddenly here comes a new fresh load of nutrients and the microbes that they need to digest it,
Right.
to utilize it.
Yeah. So the other really fascinating thing, you begin the book by just talking about how, maybe you could talk about how precious water is. You say 97.5% of water is all that stuff.
Yeah. I mean, well, first off, we are the water planet. I think Bucky Fuller pointed it out. We should be called Planet Ocean, because 2/3 of the planet's covered by ocean. That's all salty water. Without spending a lot of money desalinating, that's useless for drinking. And then 97% of the water that we do have is tied up in glaciers and icebergs and all the rest of it. So potable fresh water is extremely precious. So among the insanities of the current situation, and I open with a great quote that If you look around at the way we use water and our plumbing sanitation system, you'd have to ask, is there intelligent life on Earth? Because it's the stupidest thing in the world.
Right.
So this precious potable water, and you see this in Europe and the United States, this is all the water that comes into the house, and we use it for flushing toilets. We use it for watering our lawns, especially out here in the West where we're drier. We're using water that should be reserved for body contact and for drinking, for doing all these other things. So I think you were mentioning gray water recycling is fantastic. I mean, it's so sensible because what makes it gray water and unfit for drinking makes it perfect for the plants. So
Right.
the story we're talking about with the farmer, I mean, I've read a couple of books that the American lawn, square inch and square foot per square foot are the most polluting things that are happening in terms of water.
Yeah.
Because we're putting all this potable water on it, we're putting all these pesticides and all these fertilizers on it. At least when you're using gray water, forget the expense of buying fertilizer.
Yeah, there's so much here. You'd be proud. When I moved into Hotel Elephant, my house in downtown Boulder, it was downtown, so I was able to get rid of my car and bike every day. But I was horrified. One of the first things I had, and I killed my lawn immediately, to the consternation of my neighbors.
Yeah.
But one of the first things I had to do was spend $5,000 to fix the plumbing system. It was really expensive, and they use PVC pipe, which is toxic plastic. Like, it's the kind of stuff mothers would never let near their children. Where that handles all of our water in all of America, and we're burying it in the planet. When are we going to unbury it? People used to use clay pipe and all that. But let's and then I tried to gray water my house, and I was told I couldn't, even though there's people locally who know how to do it, which means, like, if I'm washing my hands or something with non-toxic soap, it could go and feed my super hungry, Boulder's pretty much a desert climate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but these things are changing. I recount an incident. I did a lot of work in Australia because we have a project there that I helped start up in the north. And Perth is our capital city. And, they would literally threaten you with going to jail if you did gray water irrigation recycle about 10 years ago. So a drought happened, and some people are saying that it's kind of a permanent drought, especially with global climate change. There was such an outcry from citizenry who were, basically watching their lawns and plants die, that forced the government and the health department to not only make gray water recycling legal, but now they give you a rebate and a subsidy to encourage you to do that.
Wow.
So things can change really rapidly. And I think
That's
they
wonderful.
are, because, the reality of the water shortage, the preciousness of it, is kind of facing everyone all around the world.
Yeah, in Boulder, when I moved back, we had a really horrible drought that killed a lot of our 100-plus-year-old trees one year, and immediately all of Boulder changed, and all restaurants legally couldn't offer you water unless you asked for it, because every glass of water obviously is precious, and it takes 3 glasses of water to wash every glass, and often people don't drink the water. And of course, you could request it and get it. And then as soon as the drought was over, it went back to, just throwing water everywhere.
That's a shame, because I would think that Boulder, like Berkeley, would be, like Santa Fe. Santa Fe has got some very good regulations letting homeowners do what they want with black water and gray water, as long as they're not connected to the centralized sewage plant.
So can you explain for those who don't know what gray water is and black water is, and how to use it, how you would want to see it used?
Well, I mean, I'm really in favor, we'll get back to that, composting toilets, because there's something kind of deranged about, here's another fun fact or depressing fact, that with a conventional flush toilet, it takes 10 tons of water to flush 1 ton of your waste away. So enormously wasteful. But anyway, black water is kind of techno jargon for what's actually deposited in a toilet. Some people, including myself, when I can separate black and gray water, also include the sinks from kitchens because of grease and oil and food scraps. some people don't. And gray water is definitely sinks, showers, bathtubs, and laundry. It's much lower in nutrients, although I have a little made-up rant in the book, which I really had fun writing. It's called the diaper phobia or nappy neurosis, which I've encountered talking to health regulators, because they kind of ignore the fact that for most people, the problem isn't some accidental contact with their baby's diapers. They are changing the diapers, and if you live in close quarters, you get, we all share our germs, our good bacteria and our bad bacteria. The problem is a health official thinks, well, what happens if somebody from Bangladesh stays in that house and they're carrying very infectious diseases? So, we sort of understand where those guys are at. They're just trying to protect their jobs and think about the worst case scenario. But it's wound up with regulations that are really prohibitively stopping very sensible, safe ways of doing it. So gray water recycle, if you do either drip irrigation with good mulch or subsurface irrigation, then even if there are some pathogens, which I say is very unlikely for a home situation, there's going to be no contact with it. The black water, I mean, if you need to do that, get a micro flush toilet, to minimize, what's happening there. I'm not an advocate of one solution. I love wastewater gardens and constructed wetlands, but for many people, it's much better to have just the black water go to the septic tank, and then instead of the traditional leach drain, where again the health officials would say, don't put any plants there because it may, tie up and bind up the plumbing. Now health officials say, make sure your leach drain is planted with plants. So that basically makes the leach drain a subsurface irrigation. So put all your landscaping plants out there, your fruit trees, whatever you want, not vegetables. And so you've now taken the septic tank, which is a great anaerobic bacteria digester, and hooked it up to where soils and plants and bacteria are utilizing the waste. It's really simple.
Yeah. So, Mark, if I can jump in, you have these beautiful photos. I think people get confused in talking about microbes and all this like technical stuff, but your book is so good at showing these beautiful photos of like this restaurant in Tulum, is it?
Actually, I think the one there it's just north of Playa del Carmen, but it's along that Yucatan coast just south of Cancun.
So you drive up, to go to this fancy restaurant, right? And the first thing you see is this gorgeous, flowers and gardens and trees and stuff. And it's all being fed. It's created by what?
It's created by everyone going to the bathroom. And in fact, I like to tell this story, Waylon, because this place happened to be one of these things that cater for the gringos, us, and Europeans, etc. And it's all you can eat, all you can drink. And so, people are, knocking back the margaritas, and they're staggering to the bathroom, and the staff are saying, please use the bathroom. Because all the landscaping around, I'm dropping into an Indian accent, which is inappropriate. We're down in Mexico. All of the beautiful landscaping plants really want you to go to the bathroom. Don't hold it and go back to your hotel in Cancun or Playa, please. Right. So it's kind of like the Asian guy luring you into the outhouse, into his outhouse, so he can get your valuable poop. And I kind of love it. And after Biosphere 2, that was a very intense experience where you didn't have to tell people, be mindful of what you're doing, because everything happens really rapidly here, and you have to be, so when I came out, I was what made me want to get into constructed wetlands and do them around is, I think one of our problems is that the biosphere is so big, and we get this feeling, well, it doesn't really matter if I leave the tap running, it doesn't really matter if I do this or that. If you're connected to a wastewater garden, then suddenly it all comes clear to you. Here's where my, the water in my house is going out. And people, we don't bond with microbes. We bond with beautiful plants. They're giving me fruit. They're beautiful to look at. Right. So it becomes really easy to then get that person on a wavelength Oh, well, I have this paint thinner that, just a little bit. What am I going to do with it? Well, normally you just pour it down. It's a drain, right? It's
Right.
a drain because anything that's liquid wants to go down it. Well, suddenly, if you have these beautiful plants in your wastewater garden, you think twice. So another, in the early days, we did about 40 or 50 systems down along that Yucatan coast, beautiful coral reef. We did one for an Italian restaurant, and the chef, who had no interest in any of this before, really, got so in love with his wastewater garden. It was the first thing that people, it was right across from where the cars parked, that he'd call up our people there and say, I need to clean my ovens. Is it okay to use this product or that product? And this is kind of why I really like these systems is instead of it being, an abstract universe,
Right.
what I'm doing in this kitchen is going to go out through the septic tank to that wastewater garden, and I'm going to think twice about what I do.
Yeah, instead, what people do, I just had this experience. I just traveled around Europe and Israel, and I came back and I go to this cafe here, and you don't see too many to-go cups in Italy. Yeah, I would go to this cafe, and I'm trying to be an environmentalist, so I'm like, can I get an Americano for here? Um, and they're like, well, do you mind? We're closing up in half an hour. We don't want to do any more dishes for the day. Do you mind a to-go cup? And I was like, actually, I would love it to get in the mug if that's okay. And none of this is perfect. You still have to wash the mug. I get, that I'm
Yeah,
not holier than
sure.
thou, but they're like, actually, the to-go cup, we want to give it to you in the to-go cup, and it's like a bleached, single-use to-go cup with plastic lining. That if you're in the biosphere, you're then going to be stuck with this like plastic lined to-go cup for 2 years. What do we do with this thing? Other than it'll give us all cancer if we stay here long enough. Um, but in America, I mean, I guess everywhere, we just have this culture of even my own friends in Boulder, Colorado. We just did this blog on elephant where people are lying down surrounded by the trash they produced for 1 week,
Oh,
and
wow. Oh,
it's
cool.
really beautiful and
Yeah.
inspiring. I would love to do it, and to see the result, the cause and effect or karma of our own actions, without it being out of sight, out of mind. But so we have to jump. It's silly to this. It's silly that I haven't gone there before because people are, at least, when I was in high school, it was such a big deal. It was front page of everything. I don't remember what, but Biosphere 2. So what was all that about?
Let's see. You want me to do a 30-second jam a
Oh,
whole lot of thoughts in there?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Okay, Biosphere 2 had three main objectives. Number one was to create a new kind of laboratory where we could study in miniature many of the cycles and mechanisms that underlie our global biosphere. So that's kind of the Earth application. Second is, I'm a big fan. I still go to a lot of space conferences, presenting papers and keeping up on what's happening. I think it's incredibly important, our venture into space. But, to date, and, we're really good pals with the Russians who are leaders in the field, everyone's had really limited life support capabilities, hydroponic plants, no soil, God knows, no wilderness areas. And as a friend of mine once said, I could live in a 747, with hydroponic lettuce and tomatoes if it was only for a trip across the states or across the world. But to
uh,
live there for months and years, so Biosphere 2 is kind of a vision too of what long term, if we're going to live in space, what are the psychological needs of people? You know, what kind of an environment really will sustain us? And E.O. Wilson had a fancy word called biophilia, which
yeah,
means basically, and I think we're hardwired to this. We love life. You
yeah,
know, at least if we're healthy, we love life.
yeah.
You can talk about our society and economic system, which seems to have lost the thread on that. So it was a vision of long-term space life support. And the third one, because we were making this thing virtually airtight, all the water, wastewater, everything would have to recycle. We thought that there would be a lot of spin-off technologies that would come from it. And indeed, we worked with a NASA guy and constructed wetlands, and at that time it was much less of a technology. Now it's spreading around the world. So those are
So
the three goals.
Yeah. So physically, what was Biosphere? It was this huge, like domes and la la la, and then a couple people lived, six of you or something, lived in there for 2 years.
Well, it covered about 3 acres,
Uh
uh,
huh.
and it's hard to, they should Google up pictures because it was also really a beautifully architected
Yeah.
space, geodesic domes, barrel vault domes, uh, everything aside from where the people lived in our apartments and laboratories and kitchens was covered with glass so that we got the sunlight to power the living systems. And within that 3 acres, we had a rainforest, we had a tropical savanna grassland, we had a
Wow.
thorn scrub, we had a fog desert, we had a miniature marsh system from fresh water to like Everglades mangrove species, and we had a mini ocean with what is, I still think, the largest man-made coral reef system in the world.
It's
And
like
then, and
something out
then
of it's like something out of a sci-fi movie. You know, you have the entire world. It's like the Garden of Eden almost in this small enclosed thing, and none of you could leave for 2 years or something.
well, I mean, we were volunteers, right? And
Uh,
in fact, it was big news at the time, but it's now a little blip in the thing. One of the crew had a stupid accident and severed the tip of the finger. This is
Ow.
like 2 or 3 weeks into the experiment. She went through an airlock, had the surgery in Tucson, which is about half an hour drive away, came back in. But yeah, the intention was, and let me emphasize, Biosphere 2 is an experiment. And we learned just shitloads, I should say. We learned so much from it, but it was really uncertain. I learned later that some of the people in mission control had private wagers. We went in near the end of September 1991, and they said we would be out of there by Christmas. So we had 2,000 sensors in there, both for research and for health and safety reasons. It was really uncertain whether we actually could endure in there and
Right.
something wouldn't get seriously out of whack.
Because you were creating your own oxygen and you were creating your own food and you were creating your own, you were
Yeah.
dealing with your own waste and right.
Yeah, in the little tour I left out, we had a half-acre farm, which our consultants said, we were talking before about intensive Asian farming.
Uh-huh.
They calculated that we were producing on that half acre 3 or 4 times what any half acre anywhere in the world has ever produced. But even so, it was a struggle. We unwillingly, but we endured a calorie restricted diet. The first 6 months, I think we were living on 18 to 2100 calories per day, and we were working like 3 hours a day, growing our food,
Right.
processing our food, running all of the mechanics, doing research, etc. So it was a fairly demanding lifestyle. But this gave us the incentive to become much better farmers. We used to joke, okay, here we are in this $150 million facility, super high tech, state of the art, 1991.
Yeah.
It's internet was not a word that anyone even used, but we had primitivo email and computer connections with the outside. But we were subsistence farmers.
Right.
And by God, when if you don't grow it, you don't eat it, you get to be really good. In fact, it was one of the things that I took on, utilizing unused space inside the biosphere. And as we understood it better, we could tell which kind of plant would do best in this kind of environment. So just in utilizing space that had not been covered with green plants and capturing, listen to this, I love this phrase yet, sunfall. Sunfall was our limiting factor, not rainfall, because we could hit a button. I used to joke, we don't have weather reports, we have weather requests. Person
Right.
managing the rainforest would say, I'd like an hour rain, let's say between 3 and 4 in the afternoon. And if you were working in the biosphere and you wanted to get wet, you'd wander over to the rainforest. But sunfall was our limiting factor because even with all that glass, just the shading of the structure, we only got about 40 to 50% of the outside light.
Mm.
So harvesting sunfall, and it was a beautiful it was a meditation for 2 years
Huh.
on how to capture rainfall. And this also made us, I think that, the story of Vicer 2, I still say, is the greatest story that has only been partially told.
Yeah.
Because, this is 20 years ahead of where we are now, thinking about how do we respond to global climate change. One of our number one concerns was, could we keep the CO2 from rising to unsupportable levels? And
Wow.
in fact, Vicer 2, because we had so much life, stuck into a small area. We had large ceilings, but our sky ended about 75 feet above the ground.
Yeah.
So this made it a beautiful laboratory. It was a cyclotron of the life sciences. So another, simple to digest figure, the carbon cycle. On average, scientists estimate a molecule of CO2 spends about 3 years in the Earth's atmosphere, and then it gets absorbed by the ocean, into plants, respired by microbes, whatever. That
Right.
cycle was accelerated such that that happened every 2 to 4 days.
So, like,
So,
normally we're driving around, we're creating CO2 or whatever. It takes 3 years for it to be processed by Mother Nature. You are recycling it every 3 days? What do you
yeah,
say? Yeah.
yeah. So it was like we were time travelers. We
Yeah.
were in a physical space, but 1 year meant that we had roughly 100 cycles of
Wow.
CO2 in and out of the atmosphere. So I was saying we didn't have to remind. We call ourselves biospherians, another term I love because what do we all have here? We're biospherians, but we don't have an operating manual for operating Biosphere 1, the Earth. But
Right.
we're working on it. We're inching our way towards it. But it was literally true. If we had used some pollutant in there, it would be it was a water soluble water. It would be in our cup of tea within a week.
It would be in your what?
It would be in our cup of tea or in our
I
water
see.
within a week. So
Right.
we were incredibly careful about what substances went into Biosphere 2. And this was an education for our engineers. They had to not only come up with a near impossible engineering of Biosphere 2, but everything that they proposed had to be checked out. Did it outgas? Would its byproducts be reusable by the life systems inside?
Right.
And it was such a sensitive, so, by human scales, a 3 acre house, and wilderness area seems big. After closure, there was one, and we had an analytic laboratory inside because we thought that the sick building syndrome and some pollutant buildup was like, public enemy number one. So we did analyses, and there was a couple of gases that come out of technological products that were increasing. And we asked our engineers outside. They said, well, that's a PVC glue or solvent.
Huh.
So we found out, and down in one of the technical basements, it's a true story, right? We found a little jar, like eighth of a liter or something like that.
Wow.
And somebody had cross-threaded the top. If you cross-thread a bottle, then still gases are. So
Wow.
that one little bottle, was appearing in our analyses. And as soon as we screwed that thing down properly, those gases, because we had so much life inside Biosphere, all these soil areas, aquatic areas, green plants, we had enormous ability, and we never had a trace gas buildup of concern.
That's unbelievable. There's this stat or fact that, the average under sink, like under people's sinks in their kitchen, is
Yeah,
more toxic, has more chemicals than the average laboratory before World War II or something. And, just the perfume we're spraying or the air freshener or shampoo or
yeah.
whatever we use all day is so toxic to, we always say to our environment or to our earth, but also to us. And then we wonder why cancer rates are, increasing and all that. It's amazing. That one jar, that's kind of symbolic.
Uh-oh. I thought we had muted that.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
probably President Obama. He's watching it. He's like, "Come to Washington. We're gonna send a chopper."
by the way, let me hit you with another idea. Let me see if I can.
Yeah, no problem. Ladies are always calling. What's up, poor shit?
Okay, well,
No worries.
Okay, the answering device went on.
You're a
Uh,
popular man.
the Russian tradition talks about, there's a great concept called the noosphere. I think some people are beginning to learn about that. The noosphere is kind of like, I think, where we're headed. This is when humans exercise enough intelligence that we can sort of co-evolve in a sustainable way with the biosphere. But the Russians, in the formulation, and Vernadsky, kind of the forerunner of the Gaia theory, he's the one who really understood that life isn't just a passenger on planet Earth. We have shaped the Earth, down to its core, over 4 billion years of changing the Earth.
Huh.
But anyway, they had this tradition that, and way of thinking about the world, that there's the biosphere and there's the technosphere. And you can, sort of lump everything that humans do has created a technosphere. And so what they talked about is that these two spheres have to harmonize, obviously, kind of a no-brainer. I think Barry Commoner wrote a book back in the 60s, Making Peace with the Planet. And I think that was the core of our idea of ecotechnics, that the worlds of ecology, ecosystems, and technology need to not only stop making war, but mutually benefit each other. So what I like to say about Biosphere 2 is that, and they do this in NASA, the space program, a space cabin is so tightly sealed that they screen every material, every machine, everything that goes in there to make sure that it's not toxifying the environment. So Biosphere 2's technosphere was carefully vetted that, one, it didn't release toxics or any byproduct that couldn't be recycled. And secondly, every bit of technology that was in Biosphere 2 was there to support and make the life systems do better. And when I look around our planet, it's kind of like, oh, we got a new device, we got a new chemical, it's going to make somebody money, the law of unintended consequences. We put it into play, and then we find that there's problems. This is like an ass backwards way of doing it.
Yeah.
We should be, like checking everything out. So, we had TV in Biosphere 2, and there was a great Mississippi flood during our 2-year closure. And the most horrifying thing I think I saw on that TV wasn't the houses being destroyed. It was that floodwater ripping through these warehouses with big barrels of toxic chemicals, just blowing that whole structure away, and those barrels going into the water, headed for the Gulf of Mexico. And it's kind of like, in Biosphere 2, you can't throw anything away. It's so small, it's coming back.
Right.
Well, with the technology that we have, the numbers we have, there really is no way in our global biosphere anymore. So why are we making all of these dangerous synthetic chemicals that either we know are dangerous or we don't really know what their impact is? So when we were thinking about Biosphere 2, naming it 2 was one to invite the question, where is 1? But I still see the future. Eventually, we'll have Biosphere 3, 4, 5, 100, 675, and we could use these as laboratories for testing GMO things. Let's find out what they do in a closed environment. You have a new chemical or device you want to do, put it into a closed system. Let's study
I like that. Mark, we could send like 6 or 8 Monsanto executives into a biosphere to eat their own crops for a couple years, and if they're good, maybe that's okay. So what we haven't really touched on is what you've been doing. So you're creating these wastewater gardens all around the world, Mexico, Indonesia, it looks like everywhere, Australia, Belize, Bahamas.
Not
Yeah.
everywhere, but our latest, we did a great project in Algeria that I really loved, and the Algerian, we made it in the shape of a crescent moon, which has got a lot of, symbolic resonance in Islamic culture, and we
Right.
had it right on the edge of the Sahara. The Algerian government loves it so much that they are now doing 20 or 30 for towns of 20 and 30,000 people.
Wow.
And our current one, which made me really scared the first time I went there, is we're teamed up with Nature Iraq to do a project in southern Iraq. Beautiful marshlands is the Fertile Crescent where Western civilization came from, and one of the great cultures that extend into the mists of prehistory of the marsh Arabs. And as typical, I work a lot in third world, developing world. There's no sewage treatment at all.
Right.
So we're getting backing by the local Iraqi governments and the marsh Arab towns to make wastewater gardens probably 5 to 10 acres large to treat towns of 10 to 30,000 people.
That's amazing. So, like, hypothetically, let's say you were, you know, working with the EPA and the EPA actually supported this kind of thing instead of, kind of slowing it down. And that all can change if we're activists and stuff. But would you be able to service a city like LA or a town like Boulder, like large scale?
Okay, here's the rub. To
Yeah.
do constructed wetlands, you need land. You
Right.
need an area that you can either modify from its present green use. That's what's scarce and a little bit difficult about constructed wetlands. But, I did my PhD with the great H.T. Odom, the father of ecological engineering at Gainesville. And, we took some field trips for some of our wetland ecology work to Orlando, Florida. So the EPA is not against it. There's some studies that the EPA did that for a million gallon a day, which is kind of a benchmark large sewage treatment plant, it's a little bit less expensive to do a constructed wetland. But the thing about a constructed wetland is that it only costs 10% the maintenance costs because you don't need all those chemicals, all that
Wow.
machinery. It actually gets better with time.
Right.
And 10 or 20 years, the machinery, tanks have to be replaced in conventional sewage treatment, where we're
Right.
talking about decades. So in Orlando, there are two constructed wetlands there doing final polishing from sewage treatment plants that cover 1,000 to 1,500 acres. And the really beautiful thing, and many beautiful things about this, is when we went down there, we're like, looking at the infrastructure and how it's done. People are using that for a recreational area, hiking, pushing
Wow.
baby strollers, enjoying this incredibly beautiful man-made wetland. And
Literally man-made, right?
man-made and
I mean,
completely
like,
unaware that this was wastewater treatment, sewage
yeah.
treatment.
Yeah.
So I always like to joke that in my line of work, the biggest compliment is when one nobody sniffs anything unpleasant, and they don't even know what it is. I mean, I've sat in cafes overlooking our systems in Indonesia and elsewhere, and heard people say, "Oh, what a beautiful tropical garden over there," and they hadn't seen the little discreet sign that says explains what's happening.
Yeah. That's awesome. There's this. We could end. We're well over time, but we could end with this image you write about where you're flying into.
Uh,
I think it was in the Philippines, and you see this huge river, and it's just chocolate colored, and the entire river's dead, and all the children are swimming in it. It was kind of very symbolic and sort of sad about how we're not dealing with our own waste right now.
yeah, and very quickly because I have my problems with the centralized sewage and flush toilets and
Sure.
the waste of resources and the dumping of all that nutrients. But in most of the world, the developing countries, the situation is way worse. 95%, these are recent estimates, all the sewage in the developing world is not get treated. So that is what pollutes the groundwater, the drinking water,
Right.
or the surface water. In Bali, they're using their canals and rivers as outdoor toilets. That's what's causing all of the dysentery, cholera, diarrhea that's killing literally millions of people.
And you
And
said it wasn't just hurting people, it was killing the river itself, like it was a dead
yeah,
river, no life in it.
yeah, exactly. I mean, Manila, there's a bit shocking to me. One of the 10 biggest cities in the world, and
Right.
flying in there, you could see, at 5,000 feet that was a dead river. But I did my master's degree in Tucson, and we have created a phenomena with our big conventional sewage treatments. There are no permanent rivers in southern Arizona aside from the river of shit, treated shit, that comes out of their sewage treatment plants.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, you have to keep a sense of humor, and I hope the book, you know,
Yeah.
relates a lot of the strangeness that when you encounter the mysteries of the world of water and shit, you
Well,
find.
I'm gonna. I to get to talk with a lot of amazing people on this Walk the Talk show, and I pretend to read a lot of books. This is one book I'm definitely going to read, and I think the sense of humor is, present, starting right on the cover. I love your cover. It's amazing. And you're a great writer. You've got a great voice, and I was just glued to it this morning. So,
Cool.
Dr. Mark Horseshit Nelson, thank you so much for your time.
It's been a great pleasure, Waylon.
Yeah, so as always, you can find us on SoundCloud, youtube.com/Waylon H. Lewis, and I recommend everybody Google Wastewater Gardener, and don't buy it on Amazon. Buy it at your local independent bookstore. Thank you so much.
Adios.